How's it going, everyone? It is me, the Lone Vault Wanderer, here with a Bioshock wishlist video that I hope doesn't get some Bioshock fans upset. And I know some people might just look at the title of the video and say, fuck Lone, why don't you want to go back to Rapture for Bioshock? I'm going to dislike you and disregard everything that you said because I'm not going to listen to your video. So the first thing that I want to ask from the outset, please listen to this entire video in full before you criticize me. Once you get to the end and at least hear out everything that I've said, then feel free to criticize me, then feel free to dislike this video if you do disagree. But with my Fallout Obsidian video, I saw a lot of people that were criticizing me because of things that I should have said, even though I did say those during that video. So I will ask you, please listen to my thoughts in this video before you criticize me or disagree. If you disagree, then that's within your right to do so. So before I get into my opinion, I'm going to ask all of you the question. Do you think that the next Bioshock game should return to Rapture, or should it be set in a brand new setting? Let me know in the comments below. Now, this video is kind of touching on some discussions that I had in my past Bioshock video, where it was kind of a joke video, but I talked about how I really wanted to see Bioshock be revealed at E3 of this year. And in that video, I talked about how Bioshock was a very flexible game in that you could go from a city like Rapture, which is underwater, to a floating air city like Columbia, and still have it be Bioshock, still have it feel like Bioshock and tell a great story. Essentially, I was arguing that Bioshock could really be set anywhere, so long as you have a few underlying themes or aspects still tied to that game, it'll still very much feel and play like Bioshock. But in that video, I don't believe I necessarily teased out why I don't want the next Bioshock game to be set in Rapture. And this video is going to be solely dedicated to that topic. So if I do repeat some arguments that I mentioned in that past video, I do apologize, but I want to try and get everything into one solid video so that it's a kind of a package and people can just listen to this when they want to get my opinions on it. So let me talk about why I do not believe, or that I do not want, the next Bioshock to be set in Rapture. First of all, let me get this out there. If you were to tell me that the next Bioshock game was going to be set in Rapture, it's going to go back to the underwater city, I'd be happy with that. I wouldn't complain. I wouldn't be angry or anything. I'd probably play that game, enjoy the hell out of it, and I'd be content. Right? I'm not saying that if Bioshock were going to be set in Rapture again, that I'd be upset. I'm only talking here about my desires in terms of the setting for the next Bioshock games. And why is my preference not to have the next Bioshock game set in Rapture? There's a couple of reasons. One, we're going to have a new studio working on Bioshock, right? Irrational Games, no longer working on Bioshock. It's called Ghost Story Games. Ken Levine and his smaller team are going to be doing a much, much different game to what they did with Bioshock. So we're having a brand new studio with brand new developers, the majority of which I'm going to assume have never worked on Bioshock. Yeah, maybe they're going to still be developers that were within the 2K family at one point, and maybe some of them were on the Bioshock team that got made redundant. So we could have some developers that have already worked on Bioshock, or at least similar games, like Deus Ex or whatever it is. But I'm going to assume that the majority of the new development studio that work on the next Bioshock game haven't worked on Bioshock before. And because of that, they're going to have new ideas, they're going to have different desires, they're going to have different knowledge and different skill sets and different games that they've worked on in the past. And overall, they're going to want to execute their own ideas into this new Bioshock game that they create. And I really feel like that their creative juices would flow so much better, and they'd have much more creative freedom in that sense to create the game that they want that also pleases the fans, if the game wasn't set in Rapture. Because when you set the game in Rapture, if 2K or Take-Two, the publisher, were to say the next Bioshock game has to be set in Rapture, you create that game. That instantly ties down the new development studio, because Rapture is a pre-established setting. It has a long-standing lore, history, creation, characters, downfall. Rapture already has a lot of story and history behind it. So if that setting were to be forced upon the new developer, they would have to confine themselves to that pre-established history and that already existing setting. Whereas I would actually like them to be like, you know what? We are still creating a Bioshock game. We're still going to have things that are similar to plasmids. We are still going to have a great story. We are still going to have a dystopian world that gets fucked up somehow. Really, those are the underlying elements of what Bioshock is. But it's just going to be set in a different setting. The thing that I push for most is an underground setting, because we haven't had that. We've had below the sea, we've had in the air, but we haven't had underground. I would say space, but we just had Prey, and we've already had System Shock, of course. I think underground with like volcanic settings and caves and caverns and things like that, that that would be really, really cool. But if you give them a new setting, it gives them a bit more free reign to do what they want with it. It gives them free reign to create their own setting with their own worlds, with their own rooms, with their own level design, with their own characters and history and build up and downfall. All of that is brand new, and it would allow those developers just to think of something new and fresh and really get those creative juices flowing. And I think that that would be beneficial, not just for the development studio, but also for us fans as well. Even though I still think that Rapture has some space to be explored in terms of story and area, whatever it is. The fact is, we already had Bioshock 1 set in Rapture, we've had Bioshock 2 set in Rapture, and we had the DLCs for Bioshock Infinite set in Rapture. I wouldn't mind having something different, and I think it will really create and lend to a much better game than one where the developers are restricted to the setting of Rapture. So that's the first main reason. The second main reason, and again I touched on this in my last video on Bioshock, but I have several other reasons I'll go into. But Bioshock 1 and Infinite, 2 is not really included in this, but when you consider Ken Levine's envisioning of Bioshock as a story, you consider Bioshock 1 and the ending of Bioshock Infinite, Ken Levine really tied that story together nicely. And the analogy that I used in my last video was that he kind of created this nice little present for Bioshock fans, wrapped it up in a cute bow, gave it back to us and said, that's Bioshock, I'm done with this story. And I wouldn't want a new developer to disrupt that, because I truly think that Bioshock Infinite with the DLC, Burial at Sea Parts 1 and 2, ended that story brilliantly, ended Bioshock as a story and as a franchise fantastically, and I wouldn't want to see that disturbed, because if you have another Bioshock game that's set in Rapture, you would inevitably have to unravel that story. You would have to touch on old plot points, on old characters, because it's part of the setting. You can't just ignore that. And if the developers are forced to do that, then it's going to disturb what Ken Levine gave to us as Bioshock fans. And I wouldn't want that to happen. I don't want my old lasting memories of the original Bioshocks to be compromised, I guess, in any way, or changed in any way. And that's kind of nitpicky. Yeah, I agree. We should just view those games in isolation, and that's probably a good criticism against what I'm saying now. And that later Bioshock games shouldn't ruin what you've already experienced with past Bioshock games. But it's one of those things that I think some fans, including myself, just won't be able to get away from completely. Yes, I would probably still enjoy that new Bioshock game. And yes, of course, I would still love the past Bioshock games. But I would still kind of get that sense of, they treaded on those old storylines. That wasn't really what Ken Levine was intending with that. This is the message he was trying to tell. This is the story he wanted to tell. So I just don't want that to be touched. And the third big reason, kind of tied to the second one, if you set the next Bioshock game in Rapture, instantly Bioshock 1 and Bioshock Infinite's DLC becomes the comparison point. Yes, a new Bioshock game is going to be compared to the old ones. I completely understand that. But if you set the new Bioshock games in Rapture, it's really apples and apples that you're comparing. Fans and gamers are going to be so much more able to compare instantly the new Bioshock game with Bioshock 1 and Bioshock Infinite's DLC, because it's the exact same setting. And we all likely know that this new game is probably not going to live up to the expectations set by the original games. And I have a fear that if you set the new game in Rapture, you're just going to expound upon that. Again, fans are going to be nitpicking over the lore. They're going to ask the question, oh well, who did it better, Ken Levine or this new studio? Who did Rapture more justice? Well, of course it was Ken Levine. So that new Bioshock game is always going to have that shadow looming behind it, because it chose the exact same setting as the past games. Whereas if it was a brand new setting and a brand new story with new characters, much more freedom in that regard, yes, that game can be compared to the past Bioshock games, but there's always going to be that appreciation that 1, it's a new developer working on the game, 2, it's a brand new game, but 3, it's a brand new setting with new stories, and that we'd have to judge that on its own merits. If it's a story about Rapture, you cannot help but compare it and contrast it to the other stories that we've already had about Rapture. But if it's a new setting, it stands on its own. And I think that's why as well, you don't necessarily see the comparisons between Bioshock Infinite and Bioshock 1 as you do with Bioshock 2 and Bioshock 1, because Bioshock Infinite was a brand new setting, and even though it was still Ken Levine, we had new characters to fall in love with, we had new enemies to fall in love with, new level design to fall in love with, new aesthetic. Everything about that game in terms of its setting and look, etc., was different to the original Bioshock games, and it allowed Bioshock Infinite to stand out on its own much more so than it would have if it was also set in in Rapture. And that's what I think the beauty of a brand new setting is going to be. We're going to see something fresh, something different, something that's not so tied to the past, and again, it gives the creators much more freedom to do what they want. And I myself am pushing for that underground setting. I think it could be fucking amazing, to be honest. And it's again another one of those settings, like with Rapture, like with Infinite, it's isolated away from the world. You don't necessarily have anything tied to the original stories, whether Columbia or whether Rapture. It can be its own standalone story, let the developers have their chance, and if it works out, great, you can have another game or maybe two based upon that newer setting, just like you had with Bioshock 2 to Bioshock 1. And I think that that would be the most ideal scenario for the next Bioshock game. That's what I would really want to see from it. But of course, feel free to disagree with me in the comments below, dislike the video if you don't agree, and until next time, this has been the Lone Vault Wanderer. Please take care of yourself, and would you kindly keep fighting the good fight.